Hi, and welcome everybody. I'm so happy to continue this series of faculty dialogues with San Francisco Theological Seminary at the University of Redlands Graduate School of Theology. Today, I'll be talking to Assistant Provost, Interim Dean, and Professor of the History of Christianity, Christopher Ocker, and it promises to be a fascinating conversation about the crucial value of critical thinking in today's troubled times. Before we begin, I want to tell you a little bit about our dialogue partner today. Christopher Ocker came to San Francisco Theological Seminary in 1991 and has been a member of the core doctoral faculty of the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley since 1992. He has served as the Associate Director of GTU's Center for Hermeneutical Studies, co-director of its Center for the Study of Religion and Culture, and chair of its Department for Cultural and Historical Studies. He is also affiliated with the Department of History, the Medieval Studies program, and the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion at the University of California. He's been a fellow at the Institute of European History in Mainz, an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow of the Max Planck Institute for History in Göttingen, and the Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Constance. Most recently, a senior fellow at the Center for Comparative History of Monasticism at the Technical University of Dresden, Germany. During a recent leave of absence from SFTS/GST, he proudly served as the inaugural director of the Program for Medieval and Early Modern Studies at the University for Religion and Critical Inquiry at the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne, Australia. He teaches the history of global Christianity. Recognized for his work in the medieval background of the Reformation, Ocker's research focuses on medieval and Reformation Europe, the history of biblical interpretation, religious conflict, and theology. His publications include Luther, Conflict in Christendom, Reformation Europe and History in the West, Church Robbers and Reformers in Germany, 1525 to 1547, and Biblical Poetics Before Humanism and Reformation, and numerous book chapters, articles, edited volumes, and publications. Dr. Ocker is a member of the Presbyterian Church USA, spouse in an interfaith family, parent of 3, and child of immigrants. He enjoys mountain biking, skiing, hiking, and bookbinding in his spare time. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, of course. Now, in your work, which is rooted in history and historical theology, you speak of anchoring a very contemporary concern, critical thinking, in 4 virtues. What are these virtues?
Well, I think the 4 virtues of critical thinking are curiosity, humility, charity, and prudence.
Okay, wow. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Curiosity, I think, really just is the drive to know, just the curiosity. Humility is a willingness to listen and pay attention. Charity is a kind of care that a person has toward the past, towards one's sources, towards others, and prudence. It really, I think, refers to the ability to slow down. Critical thinking is an expression of all of these things, but that last one I think is especially important. Critical thinking allows a person to slow down, to consider before taking action.
Do you feel like we're thinking too fast these days, that we're not appropriately slowing down to consider reality properly?
I think we're not thinking enough. Yeah, we live in a time, we live in such a terribly polarized time. There's a lot around us that drives us to make decisions, express commitments, take action. And of course, most of us feel very impatient with the circumstances of the world right now: pandemic, war, racial conflict, injustice. All of these things, they just seem to be bubbling up from the ground underneath us. And yeah, so naturally, the first thing we want to do is, take sides and create change. The problem is that we don't really, as individuals, we have autonomy, but we don't actually have individually that much power. And so, we can't just, make a decision to right a wrong and then simply right a wrong, because whatever we do actually is entangled with the actions of so many other people. And that creates consequences that we cannot control. And so by taking one course of action, we sometimes unleash a series of events that go in the exact opposite direction of where we'd like to go. And so that's why I think, prudence is so important, taking the time to think, to slow down, to be careful. Humility, the ability to be corrected, to change course. That those are things that we might not ordinarily associate with critical thinking, but it's really what critical thinking is all about.
Yeah, I think that, the sort of powder keg that we currently live in goes against all of these virtues. I even think of curiosity, this cultivated desire to know. When I'm feeling polarized, when I'm feeling like, there's something is a matter of urgency, I find it hard to be curious about people who think differently. I find it difficult to be curious about people whose perspectives and life experiences seem diametrically opposed either to my survival, it feels like, or the survival of those that I love.
Yeah, it takes curiosity requires a certain strength of position. You have to have confidence in the position you occupy enough to actually consider a point of view that you might not share. I love the history of religion for just this reason. Human life is full of so much craziness, and all of that carries into the history of religion too. If you want to have the opportunity to exercise that kind of attention to opinions and people you probably would not like or should not like, the history of Christianity is a marvelous opportunity to do that, because there are lots of people, lots of things that happen that are extremely well intended and seem to do very bad things. And so, yeah, study.
Let's get into that for a moment, because I think the other challenge with contemporary people is we're stuck in myopia. We think like what we're living through right now is such a historically unique time. And it might be unique in the sense of we have just at our fingertips access to the stories as well as the propaganda of so many different people and cultures. And maybe we are legitimately experiencing empathy overload by being aware so acutely of suffering in so many places. And then, as you say, feeling relatively powerless as individuals to do something about it. But zooming the lens out, surely, times of plague and political conflict and ethnic conflict are not unique. Could you speak to just one period in church history where you are an expert, where we might be able to gain some wisdom on our current predicament?
Well, yeah, you could take your pick. I mean, the place where where my mind instinctively goes is the late Middle Ages and the Reformation. We often think of the Reformation as a period of, especially Protestants, as a period of liberation, great insight, renewal, sort of taking a step in the right direction. And yet, as many scholars are pointing out, a lot of what happens in the Reformation itself is actually oppressive, and people on both sides of the religious controversy actually think that they are defending the good when they actually criminalize their opponents. There is a very complicated relationship of European societies with expanded colonial empires. I don't know that personally that the Reformation itself actually is related to colonial expansion in any particular way. I've written about this in that book you mentioned, Luther, Conflict in Christendom. But that's not to say that the changes in the world are not, that Europe itself is not entangled with changes in the world, and that the events of the Reformation have some connection to them. So it's not maybe not a causal relationship, but a kind of entanglement in which you can't really understand one set of things without understanding the other. So you can't really understand the assertion of a new form or modified form of Christian identity in, let's say, Central Europe and let's say Germany, without understanding the relationship of the Habsburg rulers of the Holy Roman Empire in Spain and their colonial enterprise, their new colonial enterprise in Mexico, and so it goes. So essentially, there's just so many opportunities to focus our attention not on heroic individuals, but on the nature of conflict and how conflict works itself out. And that's Mike, that's where I think insight can be found. Maybe you can think of a way to help me probe that a little better, because that's a whole lot and very general.
No, it makes sense. I mean, I feel like we're talking about, critical thinking and what, if anything, can individuals do? It sounds like you're introducing a very helpful critique of the inherent way that popular history is often taught, which is about heroic individuals, going out there and doing things. It sounds as though you're speaking a little bit about people power, maybe even the power of groups of people who engage in these virtues of critical thinking. And so I'm wondering if you even see any bright spots in the history of the Reformation. I spent about a decade in this sort of radical house church movement, and we drew as our inspiration, various strains of the so-called radical Reformation, whether that be Anabaptists, Quakers, Diggers, Levelers, and I know from my readings of history that those movements were not perfect either. They had a lot of extremes, a lot of really interesting and volatile elements. But I also know that they were, more or less equally persecuted by Catholic and magisterial Reformation alike. And so I'm just wondering, if you see any bright spots there, or even within magisterial Reformation or counter-Reformation, where groups of people did practice these virtues of curiosity, prudence, humility, and actually try to live out their values, maybe more congruently than this depressing litany of power and expansion that we tend to associate with organized religion these days.
Yeah, that's when you say that, the first thing that comes to my mind is actually a lot of things that would count as an abuse of power. But I think it's actually very insightful to point to the Anabaptists, or all the people who actually had that name attributed to them in the early 16th century. I think, what I think about the question, the way you just asked it. I think there are moments in which, let's say, you take the Reformation, you could find Martin Luther a very intemperate person, really, by my read. John Calvin, actually, also a very intemperate person, by in a rather different way. You could find them expressing these four virtues a lot in a lot of different situations, and I think the same would be true for some of the Anabaptist leaders, who those who particularly stand out in other kind of marginalized groups, religious groups in the 16th century. The thing is, we don't do it terribly consistently, and we have this, it's probably an evolutionary thing. This really fine capacity, actually, some animals have it too, to form groups in opposition to other groups. Conflict is an incredibly energizing social group forming kind of thing.
Right.
And so, it's a hard thing to resist, but that's essentially what civilization is all about. So here's why I think your Anabaptists are so important. First, first there's a question that a person could ask, and there's a very cynical way to ask it and a more gentle way to ask it. The cynical way to ask it is to say, did Anabaptists actually exist? And the gentler way to say it is, who are all these people who get who get accused of Anabaptism. And
Right.
when we look at them closely, one of the things we discover is that all kinds of people get accused of Anabaptism, both in the 1520s. So, like people who decide, as some did, that the doctrine of infant baptism was against Scripture, and so we have to rebaptize them as adults. They get accused of it. But there are many other people who we find in the records of persecutions of Anabaptists who are very explicit in their testimonies, and they say, I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a papist. They don't usually use the word Catholic. I'm not a papist. I'm not a Lutheran. I'm just trying to live according to the gospel. And I think that probably was true of most people in the 16th century who were not ordained ministers or priests, who were not directly engaged in the religious controversy, but found this polarization happening all around them. And I think that they formed a kind of what in a forthcoming book I call a third force, a force that has to be understood in connection with the polarizing forces of Catholic and Protestant differentiation. And that force is a very difficult force to measure, but I think you can find it in all sorts of things. You can find it in the attempts of ordinary people who trying to evade the polarizing effect of the controversy while they basically are just living their everyday lives, trying to get their work done, trying to do their thing. Then there are a few others who try to formulate, and these are very interesting people. The most famous of them would be Desiderius Erasmus, the humanist. They try to formulate, but there are many others actually, the theologians, both Catholic and some Protestants, and then others who did not want to identify with either side of the Luther controversy, the Catholic or the evangelical side. And these people, they try to formulate a position, and some of them are quite eccentric. One of my favorites is a canon of the Cathedral of Passau called Ruprecht von Mosheim, who basically formulates this idea that he knows how to solve the religious controversy in Christendom and reunite Christendom if people would just listen to him. He's a nobleman who has connections to the Austrian court, and so he's able to win audiences at cities and princely courts all over Germany. And he spends 3 years going from place to place saying, we need to convene a synod. And this synod is going to recognize that both Luther and the Pope are antichrists. He's telling Lutherans this, and he's telling Catholics this. Needless to say, he died in prison. But he's typical of a position that others also followed. So two other more famous people who followed this position, this kind of third force position, are Sebastian Frank and Caspar Schwenkfeld, two people who at the time were frequently called Anabaptists.
Right.
But both of them said, actually, baptism just doesn't really matter at all. So they weren't actually promoting rebaptism. They were just saying the external visible things in the church are just not really that important.
Similar to the Quakers, who kind of internalized all of the sacraments and said that they're a spiritual vitality as opposed to, their divisive exterior forms.
Very much so. In fact, like the Quakers, they drew on some of the same sources in late medieval mysticism. Of course, so too did famous reformers like Luther and Calvin. So there are places where even those very polarized kind of thinkers, that's what I would call. I don't think you can take an open-minded look at the history of the 16th century and say Luther was not a polarizing figure. He was clearly a polarizing figure.
Right.
Calvin was clearly a polarizing figure. As much as I like and admire both of them, I kind of enjoy, polarizing figures. They're interesting.
They are.
and history is riddled with them. And I'm not even sure if we can, if human society knows how to live without them. But so I don't really mean to dismiss these these foundational figures in two major Protestant traditions, but or for that matter, suffer the fate of Ruprecht von Mosheim, who died in prison, where the same prison, by the way, where he once actually was assigned the task of preaching to Anabaptist refugees who had been, picked up and thrown in jail by the Bavarian Duke. Anyway, these polarizing figures too. They make compromises. They compromise their principles. They make practical decisions. They do things that that can be ideologically inconsistent or reveal tensions in the positions that they hold themselves. And I think those are the places where insight can be found. So all of that is to say, there is an alternative to thinking about a historical movement around its leading individuals and saying, well, the Reformation, that's Martin Luther. That's about Martin Luther and this genius idea that Luther came up with. The one that's usually cited nowadays is Luther's concept of evangelical freedom. And then that unleashed this whole revolution in society. I think that's a very difficult argument to make historically on the basis of like social or political historical evidence. And but there's an alternative. The alternative is to say, well, actually, I don't study Luther or Calvin or the Reformation as a form of homage to individuals or worship or admiration. I do it for critical insight. Yes, true. Presbyterian, I'm in a tradition that's deeply affected by John Calvin's thought and a whole lot of other things that are and a history that goes way beyond the history of Geneva in the early 16th century. I would say, thank God. But sure, that's an important touchstone, but it's not it's not the understanding the individual John Calvin or appreciating John Calvin. That's not why I study history. I'm trying to get insight on human life. That's why I think we should. That's why I think we should study. That's how I think it's an expression. Study is an expression, historical study, an expression of curiosity, humility, charity, and prudence. I don't have to read the Reformation in order to take sides in the Reformation.
Yeah. Wow. You said a lot there, and I want to say,
Sorry.
No, this is good. I want to try to be concise, though. I think you raised an interesting question about, the way I would distill it is, can civilization exist without conflict, without people that with these sort of bombastic ideas bumping up against each other, even leading, from everything from debate to violence? And it would seem that civilization can't exist without this, which is, I think, a quandary for any sincere follower of Jesus that's trying to take, say, the Sermon on the Mount seriously. But I also find, I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but books like The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber, where they're critiquing civilization itself and saying we weren't always civilized, quote unquote, as a species, and that as immediate return foragers, as hunter-gatherers, we were more wired and socially rewarded for cooperative behavior rather than competitive behavior. So that's one thought is, can we relinquish the more combative elements of civilization, or are they so deeply ingrained in us since the advent of complex agriculture that there's just no doing it and we're going to go down with the ship? That's one thought. Another thought is
such an important question.
It is, and I want to hear your insight in a second. But to touch on another thing that you said, it sounds like you're critiquing the great men view of history, as well as maybe the great ideas view of history. That maybe it can't just be simply reduced to certain sound bites that have changed everything. And it sounds to me like you're advocating for a people's history approach, maybe. Which reminds me of some work that Diana Butler Bass has done on a popular level, or Rita Brock and Rebecca Parker with their church history book, Saving Paradise, or even Fortress's People's History of Christianity series, where they're attempting to look at even the non-literary artifacts of entire swaths of people, as opposed to the so-called idea leaders of a given period of time? What's the art? What's the ordinary correspondence and letters that are sent? What can we figure out from their funerary practices and their eating practices? Like, how did people actually live? And so I'm curious too, if you would say that there is this third force manifest by a majority of people who might feel a little caught in the crossfire between, ideologues, but are just trying to live their best life. Like, is it actually more hopeful from a people's history approach to look at Christianity than a great men or great ideas approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's really where the trends of historical research have led a lot of us in the last 2 generations. So there was a surge of interest driven from various causes, but and various trends coming out of the 1960s that re-examined a lot of these things and moved away from ideas as such, or associated ideas with a broader source basis. So not just, sort of the predominant individuals and how one concept gets passed down from one teacher to another, but to the role of knowledge production in society more broadly conceived. So, not just intellectuals, literature, but also verbal expression, art. There is, in much of the history of art, there is a complex relationship between written expression and art. That's certainly true through a lot of the Middle Ages and a lot of religious art, but it goes beyond that. And yeah, absolutely. So that's really the trick. One of the difficult things, though, is figuring out how to integrate a history of theology, the history of theology, with that kind of a view. And there's a tendency for the two to operate differently. I think one way you can do that is by paying close attention to the lives of the people who are actually producing knowledge and the circumstances within which they produce it. So instead of looking at the ideas as sort of freestanding, you see them as theological ideas are kind of unique, and philosophical ideas. They operate according to rules. You can approach them in a self-standing way. You can understand the force of an argument, what its sources are, the structure of its logic, all of these sorts of things. You don't really need a social history to understand that. The trick is to realize that those rules too, the meaning of those rules in society, is conditioned by the way they're used, and the way they're used often violates that logic, or ignores that logic, or is simply opportunistic. And that's true in so many things. So an interesting case in point is, but the way that happens is really revealing. So an interesting case in point is the problem of church property in the Reformation, where one of the things, the way the Reformation happened in everyday life, most concretely, was towns and princes decided to take the income of a perfectly legally appointed priest and give it to somebody else.
Wow.
And right, so that's when you go into a church and you say, you know what, this guy doesn't preach the gospel, now we're going to appoint someone who does. What you're actually doing is you're firing somebody that you can't actually fire because you're not their boss, and you're appointing somebody else in their job.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
That's a pretty radical move. So how do you but there's no other way to pay for a preacher in a church but by basically taking control over somebody else's property. Sure. Or property over which you have some sort of shared jurisdiction. And that's what city councils and princes did again and again and again. Well, that produced hundreds, if not thousands, of lawsuits. And those lawsuits have a history, and they got funneled and so forth. And then how did the people confronting these lawsuits, the princes and cities, how did they defend themselves? Well, they turned to their theologians. Why did they turn to their theologians? Because they decided that their strongest case was going to be made by defending their legal responsibility to protect true religion.
Mm, mm.
So they said they needed their theologians. These are just, princes and city magistrates. They needed their theologians to explain to them why their religion was the true religion that justified their intervening in church business over against, these priests who were properly appointed to this. And that's what they did. And the amazing thing is it worked. And the theologians, this includes some of the most famous figures in the Reformation. Luther was not terribly involved with this, peripherally involved with this, but Calvin's somewhat involved. Martin Bucer, Philip Melanchthon, very, very deeply involved, and numerous other Protestant theologians around the Protestant League of Small Calton in particular. And they stepped in and they said, you know what? Our preaching of the gospel is in defense of the responsibility named in canon law, the law of the Catholic Church, and in Roman law. So the other authority, the higher authority, and essentially that would refer to Byzantine law, which is the model for non-church law in Western Europe in the Renaissance. He said, we have a true interpretation of religion, and these guys, they're defending true religion according to the obligations established in both canon and Roman law. They're basically saying we are in continuity with the Middle Ages.
Right, and you're not. You've abandoned the post. You may have said
you've abandoned the post. So you say we're robbing churches, and we answer, oh no, you're robbing the churches. We're defending the churches. You've already robbed them. We're just restoring them.
Yeah, and
it worked. And it worked.
That's so interesting. On the one hand, that feels so foreign to our ears with separation of church and state, separation, allegedly at least, of courts and religious institutions. But on the other hand, like, history repeats itself. I think of all the controversies when more conservative splinter groups in the United States are leaving mainline Protestant denominations. And the question is, who owns the building? There's like all these disputes. I was a part of a post-evangelical congregation in Raleigh that was historically tied to a Pentecostal denomination. But when our minister over the course of a decade began, teaching evolution, teaching, LGBTQ affirmation, et cetera, eventually the denomination, which had kind of a more Episcopal governance structure, stepped in and said, hey, we're stripping your pastor of his credentials with us. And you all, the congregation, get to decide. You can keep your building, which you have basically paid for, and we're going to appoint you a new minister. Or if you're wanting to stick with your minister, y'all have to find a new place because we actually own the building. And, our congregation unanimously voted, we're going with our minister. And then we got kicked out. So, these ideas of crisis of conscience, what actually constitutes true faith, and can people's paychecks and assets be stripped away, while the state is involved in more complex ways in adjudicating that these days. I think that the questions are still quite relevant.
They're really relevant. And and there's a lot and these are the sorts of questions that people never ask, like, what can we learn something, about how people can approach these sorts of problems from church history? Yeah, actually you can. But you have to set your lens a little bit differently. And you'll also have to think about a lot more things. It's not easy to do this kind of syncretic thinking about life. Whole theological debates. Theology can be a bit hard, so some of it's pretty complicated, particularly in the late Middle Ages. You got to try and do that correctly, and then at the same time try and understand daily life. Vastly different kinds of sources. They require really different skills than what you use when you're reading a book in manuscript or an early printed book. But that's what we should do, because that's where insight will be found.
Absolutely. Do you want to speak at all to what I was saying earlier about, is civilization inherently prone to conflict, and is there a way that we can transcend civilization based on historical reading?
Yeah. It's probably, yeah, yeah, I do. I would like to say something about that. Thanks. You know, civilization is an amazing thing, and you know, and when a civilization gets violent, it does it on a pretty remarkable, just horrifying scale. Yet on the other hand, you know, you just think of how much of it works. It's really quite a miracle too. Um, I don't know about, you know, I don't know about small groups, and through most of our history as hominins and hominids, you know, because I think that, you know, there are times when groups find themselves in competition for resources, and even if they're small, things get ugly. It's kind of seems fallacious to me to assume that that primitive life is always more peaceful than contemporary life, but the consequences happen at a different scale, don't they?
Yes.
There's so, you know, there's a lot that we do that, you know, as civilizations that works. We're deeply interconnected across the globe. We're also equally interdependent. It's very, very difficult for us to extract ourselves from those interdependencies. There's so many things in which we have where we've learned, and we learn every day, that compromise is mutually beneficial. That understanding your opponent, and you know, and approaching them charitably can be extraordinarily effective and beneficial to both sides. I mean, I think really what we have to do is figure out how to lean toward that, you know, that constructive side, and away from the violent side, because our capacity for violence is just so horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, there's our capacity for overt violence, and then I think there's our capacity for inability to process or pass the buck of large scale challenges, i.e., climate change. You know, one of the things
Oh yeah.
that our studies of anthropology teach us is that, you know, because we evolved over, you know, tens of thousands of years to live in these small bands, we have a hard time feeling empathy for and taking action for groups of more than 200 people. And so you're right, in many ways we are learning and stretching our empathetic capacities, but as like Jeremy Rifkin frames it in The Empathic Civilization, we're in this race between empathy and entropy. And, you know, sometimes our technologies outstrip our ability to have empathy, and then they have all of these unintended consequences. So can we actually develop a sense of collective felt responsibility, not just in a mind, you know, crunching data way of, oh, this is what climate change is doing, but on a level of story, on a level of heart, on a level that we do feel like we have a lever and a place to stand to actually make these changes? Do you see any historical hope, or hope rooted in these virtues of critical thinking, that might be able to get us there before it's too late?
Well, you know, I mean, yeah, we solve problems all the time, and we do it on a grand scale. I mean, you know, we just have trouble doing it consistently. So yeah, you know, I mean, you know, the Cold War did end. I mean, might be reviving now, but it did end. The nature of the nature of you know, the nature of a nuclear threat has changed. It's, you know, there are things like that. I remember when I was young, you might be, I hope you're too young to remember this. You know, there were, you know, in the New York suburbs where I grew up, there were, you know, essentially uninhabitable areas that were polluted so bad. And, you know, with the right environmental protections in place, with, you know, more control of chemical waste and that sort of thing, you know, they revived, and you know, the nature recovered. So we do it. It's just so hard to do it consistently. I don't think, you know, I'm not sure. It's the heart, you know, change hearts first, and then, you know, the rest will follow approach is difficult. It's difficult to make a strong case for that from history.
Right.
I don't think the problem of climate change, for example, is going to be effectively addressed by individual choices, you know, by accumulating individual choices. So, okay, I'm willing to pay a carbon offset for my flight to Abu Dhabi next month, and so therefore I'm going to be making a difference. That's not really that does not match the gravity of this situation. So it's really difficult. But
I agree, and I agree that a more top-down approach is probably necessary. And yet, there's I would say that with climate crisis and then an ensuing refugee crisis, it tends to lead towards more authoritarian leaders being elected around the world, who, in theory, if they were environmentalists, could enact top-down sweeping changes that would paradoxically be okay. But I feel like those authoritarians these days are riding on this sort of neo-libertarian populism that makes the idea of top-down decision-making more and more odious to a larger and larger base of people. And so it's difficult to, as we've seen with the pandemic, if you say something simple like wear a mask, people are like, but my rights, my individual liberties. I can't imagine what it would have been like to have seatbelt laws in an age of social media.
You wonder, don't you? And yet, how many people actually, are willing to, riot against seatbelts? We are capable of change, and we know we have ways of inclusive ways of expressing democratic action. And those are the ones that we have to rely on. But that's also why I think the kind of study we're talking about, and including the study of religion and theology, is so important, because it's really about, ultimately, it's really about developing what I think you might call ecological habits of mind. So habits of mind that don't instinctively assume that the ultimate question in moral decision making is simply my ability to make the right choice and take action on it, but that the real goal is to understand how constructively to collaborate to find solutions to really difficult, intractable problems. Like, war, truly, the most insane thing, the most insane form of conflict resolution known to the human race has got to be, in our day, war.
Yeah.
It causes so much destruction. We've just given how much to the Ukraine, and that was a great deal of money that might have been used before war to find a solution to a problem. It's really difficult. But once people start hitting each other, it's pretty easy to get them lined up and galvanized, and so it happens. Prudence.
Yeah. Measuring, who wins a conflict in terms of how many of your soldiers die and how much property damage do you inflict is absolutely insane. Well, so to transition here, because I know we don't have much time left, we're speaking of this absolutely, crucial virtue in this day and age of critical thinking. How does an education at San Francisco Theological Seminary help, whether someone's a recent undergrad or a mid-career professional or a minister looking to go deeper? How does an education here help develop these virtues of critical thinking?
To put it simply, it gives you time to study. That's what we do. We give you time and place to study, and to do it in an incredibly rich and open-minded environment. So here we're a small community of and close-knit community of faculty and students in a very beautiful place. We have a stunningly beautiful campus in the hills of the North Bay, outside of San Francisco. We're at the fringe of one of the country's most dynamic and interesting metropolitan areas. We are founding members of the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Our students enjoy this intimate community, close interaction with their faculty, and access to over 100 professors in the Graduate Theological Union and about 200 courses in any given semester. Wow. And the opportunity to study at the University of California, Berkeley, if they wish, as GTU students. So the opportunities to study here are extraordinarily rich. but we, you know, we approach, as the poem says, we dream with we dream with our eyes wide open, and our eyes and our hearts are open here to our students, to their experiences. So one of my colleagues, Greg Love, likes to say, you know, we don't tell people what to think, we teach them how to think. And but what that means here is that, you know, we're interested in listening, in hearing, and hearing you and watching you develop your own voice, your own point of view, your own critical insight. We don't expect it to conform to any critical, any, you know, sort of established model or paradigm. And, you know, we do that in frankly, you know, a lot of it are the traditional ways of a Protestant theological curriculum, the study of the Bible in Hebrew and Greek and its historical circumstances and as literary artifacts, and sources of spiritual insight, systematic theology as a discipline of critical reflection on religious experience, the history of Christianity in the manner that we've been discussing it here. Christian ethics, but social ethics, ethics aimed not so much at individual decision-making, but social impact. The skills and arts of pastoral ministry, spirituality as a foundation of justice and action for justice, rather than spirituality as a form of escape, although frankly, we could all use an escape.
Might be better than Netflix or video games, but yeah. Wow. So what I'm getting is that, you know, at SFTS, it's not this sort of mass-produced educational experience. It's more of a crafted experience where students have an unusual level of access to you all as this, you know, brilliant faculty, both your immediate local faculty and then the larger GTU availability. And while I know that you offer a variety of exclusively online programs and if memory serves, low residency programs, it sounds like there's a lot of value to being there.
Well, there really is, and yeah, there really is, and and it's an easy place to be. The you know, the other thing I should mention too is that since the merger with the University of Redlands, we've been able to bundle some of our traditional offerings together with certificates and eventually also other graduate programs that allow students to expand their skill set in directions that trend toward innovative ministry beyond the pastorate and congregational leadership.
Right. There's so many ways to learn now. That's beautiful, and ways to apply this learning. Well, so I'm going to put this link in the show notes, but if you're watching this and you're curious, you want to check it out for yourself, check out redlands.edu/GST. And final question, Christopher, what are you working on right now and why is it interesting to you?
Well, I'm just finishing a book called The Hybrid Reformation, which will be published by Cambridge University Press either late this year or early next year. And that is a study of the kind of dynamics that we were talking about before. So it looks at both social life and intellectual life and tries to trace out in the ordinary people in the Reformation and also in the kind of main trends of Reformation theology and biblical interpretation and scholarship, third forces. So these forces that contradict, undermine, provide alternative viewpoints toward polarization between Catholics and Protestants, which was, you know, drove a lot of the Reformation as a religious controversy.
Got it. Wow. I wish we had more time. I'd love to dive more into this idea of third force with you, but thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us today. Christopher, I hope that any one of you watching this here will tune in and check out the offerings at San Francisco Theological Seminary at the University of Redlands if you're interested in more. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.